see a hazard. But do you see the risk? And are hazard and risk actually the same thing? They're often used as if they mean the same thing. But in workplace safety, they describe two different things. Let's understand the difference through simple workplace situations. First, let's connect this with what we learned in our previous lesson. In our previous lesson, we learned how to recognize unsafe acts and unsafe conditions. But identifying something unsafe is only the beginning. Now we need to ask two important questions. What can cause harm? And what is the risk from that hazard? This takes us from simply observing an unsafe situation to understanding it. So let's start with the first question. What is a hazard? What can cause harm? That question helps us identify the hazard. A hazard is a source, situation, or condition with the potential to cause harm. For example, moving machinery, electrical energy, a chemical substance, or a hot surface. So whenever you're looking for a hazard, ask yourself one simple question. What here has the potential to cause harm? Now let's test that idea. Look carefully. What hazards can you identify? Try to identify them before I reveal the answers. An exposed moving part can cause injury. Electrical energy can cause shock or burns. And a slippery floor can lead to a slip and fall. Different situations, but each contains something with the potential to cause harm. So remember this simple idea. Hazard means what can cause harm? It may be a source, a situation, or a condition. But identifying the hazard is only half the story. Now comes the next important question. What is the risk? Risk is the possibility of harm from exposure to a hazard. To understand risk, ask two questions. How likely is the harm? And how serious could it be? Think about exposed electrical energy. The electrical energy is the hazard. But could a worker come into contact with it? And if that happens, how serious could the harm be? That is how we begin thinking about risk. Now let's put the two concepts together. Hazard, what can cause harm? Risk, what could happen, how likely is the harm, and how serious could it be? But notice something important between the two. Exposure. A hazard may exist, but risk depends on whether and how someone can be exposed to it. So remember, hazard, exposure, risk. Here's an important question. Can the same hazard have different levels of risk? Yes, the hazard may remain the same while exposure and controls are different. For example, a machine may still contain moving parts, but effective guarding can reduce worker exposure. So the hazard may still exist while the risk is reduced. And that's why controls are so important in workplace safety. Now it's your turn. What is the hazard? The hazard is exposed electrical energy. Now think one step further. Where's the risk? The risk relates to the possibility of a person being exposed to that electrical energy and being harmed. Hazard identified. Now we're thinking about risk. Let's try another situation. What is the hazard here? The slippery floor. Now ask, what could happen? A person could slip, fall, and suffer an injury. So the slippery floor is the hazard. The risk depends on the possibility of that harm occurring and how serious the consequence could be. This is the distinction I want you to remember. Hazard is not the same as risk. A hazard is the potential source of harm. Risk considers the possibility and potential consequence of that harm. And here's another important point. The hazard may remain while the risk can be reduced. That distinction is fundamental to workplace safety. So how should a safety professional look at a workplace situation? Start with 5 questions. What can hurt someone? Who can be exposed? How could it happen? How serious could the consequence be? And finally, what controls can reduce the risk? This takes us beyond simply spotting a hazard. It helps us understand what could happen and what we can do about it. Before we continue, avoid these 4 common mistakes. First, hazard and risk are not the same thing. Second, risk doesn't mean likelihood alone. The potential consequence matters too. Third, the existence of a hazard does not automatically mean the risk is high. Exposure and controls matter. And fourth, no accident does not mean no risk. Risk can exist before anyone gets hurt. If you remember only one sequence from today's lesson, remember this: hazard, exposure, risk, control. First, identify what can cause harm. Then determine who or what can be exposed. Understand the risk. And finally, decide how that risk can be reduced. Hazard, exposure, risk, control. Before we finish, let's see if you can get all 3 questions correct. Question 1. A rotating machine part can injure a worker. What is the hazard? Moving machinery. Question 2. A worker approaches without adequate protection. What affects the risk? Exposure and controls. And question 3. Which statement is correct? C. A hazard is a potential source of harm. Risk considers possibility and consequence. How many did you get right? Today, we learned one very important difference. Hazard, what can cause harm? And risk, how likely is the harm and how serious could it be? But knowing what a hazard is creates another important question. How do we systematically find hazards before they cause harm? And that takes us directly to our next lesson: hazard identification. In the next lesson, we'll learn how to systematically identify hazards in the workplace, including hazards that may not be immediately obvious. Because if we don't identify the hazard, we can't effectively manage the risk. Stay safe, prevent accidents, protect lives. Connect with AG Academy Industrial Safety and Manufacturing Excellence. Learn, improve, excel.